Angela Marie Houseman was a bright light in her St. Anne, Missouri neighborhood. At 9 years old, she was a bundle of energy and smiles, just a typical fourth grader with a love for her friends and family. They called her Angie. She had sparkling eyes and a trusting nature, always seeing the good in the world around her. She loved riding her pink and white bicycle, the wind in her hair as she pedaled through the familiar streets. Her laughter was a common, happy sound on her block, a melody of childhood innocence. Angie was the kind of little girl every parent cherishes, full of life and promise. She was a daughter, a friend, a child with dreams for the future, a future that stretched out before her like a long, sunny road. On the afternoon of November 18, 1993, that sunny road took a dark and sudden turn. It was a chilly day, but Angie was eager to go home. The school bus dropped her off just a short walk from her front door, a route she had taken countless times before. She waved goodbye to her friends, her book bag slung over her shoulder, just another ordinary school day ending. Her mother was waiting for her, expecting to hear about her day, maybe help with homework and share a snack. The distance was so small, a journey that should have taken only a few minutes. But on this day, Angie never made it home. The familiar path became a place of unimaginable terror. The moments ticked by, turning into an agonizingly long wait. Minutes stretched into an hour. Her mother's initial calm slowly eroded, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Where was Angie? She wasn't one to wander off without permission. She knew the rules. A quick check with neighbors yielded nothing. No one had seen her since she stepped off the bus. The calls began, first to friends, then to the school. A knot of fear tightened in her mother's stomach. The ordinary rhythm of a weekday afternoon had been shattered, replaced by a chilling silence where Angie's cheerful greeting should have been. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. The sun began to set on that November day, casting long, cold shadows across the empty street. Angie's pink and white bicycle sat where she had left it, a lonely sentinel waiting for a rider who would not return. The familiar neighborhood, once a place of safety and comfort, now felt menacing and strange. The absence of one small girl created a void so immense it seemed to swallow all the light and warmth from the world. A frantic 911 call was made, and the official search began. But for Angie's family, the nightmare had already started. A little girl, precious and loved, had vanished into thin air, just steps from the safety of her own home. The news of Angie's disappearance spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community of St. Anne. It was the kind of news that every parent dreads, a story that turns a peaceful town into a place of collective anxiety. Suddenly, every stranger was viewed with suspicion, and every child was held a little tighter. The comfortable bubble of suburban safety had burst, leaving behind a raw and palpable fear. Police cars patrolled the streets, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The search for Angie Houseman was on, and an entire community held its breath, praying she would be found safe and sound. It was a shared nightmare, uniting neighbors in a common, desperate cause. Volunteers emerged from every corner of the city and beyond, their faces etched with concern. They were mothers, fathers, teachers, and strangers, all moved by the plight of a missing child. They organized search parties, combing through parks, woods, and every conceivable hiding place. Hundreds of people walked shoulder to shoulder, calling out Angie's name, their voices echoing in the cold November air. They distributed flyers bearing her smiling face, plastering her image on storefronts, telephone poles, and car windows. The hope was that someone, somewhere, had seen something, anything that could bring their little girl home. The community's response was a powerful testament to human compassion in the face of tragedy. The media descended on the small Missouri town, broadcasting Angie's story across the nation. Her face was on every news channel, her story in every newspaper. The case captivated the country, a heartbreaking reminder of the vulnerability of children. Law enforcement officials worked around the clock, following up on every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. They interviewed classmates, neighbors, and registered sex offenders in the area. A command center was established, its walls covered with maps and notes, a hub of frantic activity. Yet, despite the massive effort and the intense public focus, there was no sign of Angie. It was as if she had been erased. As days turned into a week, the initial wave of frantic hope began to recede, replaced by a grim and growing despair. The search parties grew smaller, though the core group of dedicated volunteers never gave up. The yellow ribbons tied around trees and mailboxes, once symbols of hope for Angie's safe return, began to look weathered and sad. The community, once united in action, was now united in a shared sense of grief and helplessness. The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone. How could a child simply vanish? The disappearance of Angie Hausman left a deep and lasting scar on the heart of her community, a wound that would not begin to heal for a very long time. For 9 long days, the community of St. Anne clung to a fragile thread of hope. They prayed for a miracle, for a phone call that would say Angie was safe. But on November 27, 1993, that thread was brutally severed. A deer hunter walking through a remote wooded area in the August A. Bush Memorial Conservation Area made a horrifying discovery. It was miles away from Angie's home, a desolate and lonely place. Partially hidden in the undergrowth, he found the body of a small child. The authorities were called immediately, and the heart-wrenching task of identification began. The worst fears of an entire region were about to be confirmed in the most tragic way possible. The body was identified as that of 9-year-old Angie Hausman. The news fell like a hammer blow, crushing the last remnants of hope for her safe return. The yellow ribbons now seemed to mock the community's prayers. An autopsy would later reveal the horrific details of her final hours. She had been abducted, held captive, and subjected to unspeakable violence before her life was cruelly taken. The cause of death was determined to be exposure, but she had been left to die, alone and terrified in the cold woods. The innocence of her childhood had been stolen by a predator of unimaginable cruelty. The search for a missing girl was over. The hunt for a monster had just begun. The investigation shifted from a missing person case to a homicide. Detectives and forensic experts swarmed the crime scene, meticulously gathering every piece of potential evidence. They collected fibers, hairs, and anything that seemed out of place. Most critically, they were able to recover a DNA sample from the perpetrator. In 1993, DNA technology was still in its relative infancy, and while the sample was preserved, it could not be immediately matched to a suspect in any existing database. It was a tiny, microscopic clue that held the key to justice, but it was a key that could not yet be turned. The evidence was carefully bagged and stored, a silent witness waiting for science to catch up. The murder of Angie Hausman sent a shockwave of grief and outrage through the community and beyond. It was a crime that defied comprehension, the brutal murder of an innocent child. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by hundreds of mourners who came to say goodbye to the little girl they had only known through news reports and flyers. The investigation continued with grim determination, but the trail was growing cold. Leads dried up, and persons of interest were cleared. The killer had seemingly vanished, leaving behind a devastated family and a community forever changed by the loss of one of its own. Angie's case was far from forgotten, but it was slowly, painfully becoming a cold case. Years began to pass, and the vibrant headlines about Angie Hausman's case faded from the front pages. The investigation, once a flurry of activity, slowed to a crawl. Detectives pursued every lead they had, but each one led to a dead end. The killer remained a ghost, a nameless, faceless figure who had committed a monstrous act and then disappeared back into the shadows. For Angie's family, there was no closure, only the unending pain of her absence and the torment of unanswered questions. Anniversaries of her abduction came and went, each one a painful reminder of the justice that remained elusive. The case file grew thicker, filled with reports and dead-end leads, but no closer to an arrest. The case officially became cold, a term that belies the burning fire for justice that never went out in the hearts of the investigators who had worked on it. Detectives retired and new ones took their place, but Angie's file was always there, a solemn responsibility passed down from one generation of law enforcement to the next. They would periodically review the evidence, re-interview witnesses, and hope for a new break. They never gave up on Angie. The community, too, remembered. Every so often, a local news story would revisit the case, keeping her memory alive and reminding the public that a child's killer still walked free. The silence was long, but it was never absolute. For more than 2 decades, the most crucial piece of evidence sat in a freezer, the killer's DNA. When it was first collected in 1993, the technology to make full use of it was limited. The National DNA Database, CODIS, was in its early stages, and there was no match. As the years went by, forensic science made incredible leaps forward. New techniques emerged that could analyze smaller or more degraded samples. The investigators on Angie's case were aware of these advancements, waiting patiently for the right time and the right technology to give them the break they so desperately needed. The DNA was their silent partner in the investigation, holding a secret that it could not yet tell. The turning point came with the rise of forensic genetic genealogy. This revolutionary technique allowed investigators to use the DNA from a crime scene to identify potential relatives of a suspect by searching public genealogy databases. It was the same technology that had famously been used to catch the Golden State Killer. In 2019, 26 years after Angie's murder, detectives decided to try this new approach. They sent the killer's DNA profile to a specialized lab. It was a shot in the dark, a final high-tech attempt to break through the long, cold silence. The hope of a generation of detectives now rested on the microscopic strands of DNA, a silent witness finally given a voice. The forensic genealogists went to work, uploading the killer's DNA profile to a public database. They were not looking for an exact match to the suspect, but for his relatives. They were building a family tree, not for a historical project, but for a manhunt. The process was painstaking, requiring both scientific skill and meticulous detective work. Soon, they found a partial match, a distant cousin of the unknown killer. From there, they began to trace the branches of the family tree, narrowing down the possibilities. They followed lineages forward and backward in time, slowly closing in on the person whose genetic signature had been left at the scene of a horrific crime a quarter of a century earlier. The genetic trail led them to a man named Earl Webster Cox. He was 60 years old in 2019, living in the same area where he had lived back in 1993. His name had never come up as a major suspect in the original investigation. He was just another face in the crowd, a man who had lived an outwardly normal life while harboring a monstrous secret. He had been just 34 years old when he abducted and murdered Angie Hausman. For 26 years he had lived freely, perhaps even passing by the memorials set up for the little girl whose life he had stolen. The genetic evidence, however, was pointing directly at him, a silent accusation from beyond the grave. Investigators now had a name, but they needed to be certain. They needed a direct DNA sample from Cox to compare with the evidence from the crime scene. They began a covert surveillance operation, watching him and waiting for an opportunity. The chance came when Cox discarded a cigarette butt. Detectives carefully collected it and sent it to the crime lab for analysis. The lab went to work comparing the DNA from the cigarette to the DNA recovered from Angie's body all those years ago. The results came back, and they were conclusive. It was a perfect match. The ghost in the jeans had a name, and his name was Earl Webster Cox. The arrest was made in October 2019. After 26 years of waiting, of wondering, of grieving without answers, a suspect was finally in custody. For the investigators, both active and retired, it was a moment of profound, hard-won victory. For Angie's family, it was a whirlwind of emotions, relief that a suspect was caught, but also a fresh wave of grief as the terrible details of the case were brought back into the light. Earl Webster Cox, the man who had lived in anonymity for so long, was now unmasked. Justice, delayed for so long, was finally beginning to dawn. The science that had been in its infancy when Angie died had matured and delivered on its promise. The arrest of Earl Webster Cox sent a new kind of shockwave through the community. This was not some transient drifter or a stranger from a faraway place. This was a local man. He had lived among them, worked alongside them, and perhaps even shared a friendly nod with the very people who had searched for Angie. The revelation that the monster was not a far-off boogeyman but a neighbor was a chilling concept. It shattered any remaining illusions of safety and underscored a terrifying truth. Evil can wear a very ordinary face. Cox had a criminal record, but for lesser offenses, nothing that would have put him on the radar as a potential child murderer in 1993. He had hidden in plain sight. The legal proceedings began, and the full weight of the evidence was brought against Cox. The DNA match was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, an irrefutable link between him and the crime. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. Confronted with the certainty of the scientific evidence, there was little room for him to deny his guilt. The man who had maintained his silence for over 2.5 decades was finally forced to confront his actions. For Angie's mother, and the community that had mourned with her, seeing him in a courtroom, stripped of his anonymity, was a crucial step toward some form of closure, however incomplete. The case of Angie Hausman has broader implications that resonate far beyond St. Anne, Missouri. It serves as a powerful testament to the perseverance of law enforcement and the revolutionary impact of forensic science. Cold cases are no longer hopeless. With advancements in DNA technology, time is no longer an insurmountable barrier to justice. Killers who thought they had gotten away with their crimes can now be held accountable, decades later. This case offers a ray of hope to countless other families who are still waiting for answers, proving that no case is ever truly closed as long as there is evidence to analyze and dedicated people seeking the truth. Justice for Angie, however, does not erase the tragedy. A conviction cannot bring her back or heal the deep wounds of her family. But it does provide a final, definitive answer to the question of who was responsible. It ensures that the person who committed this unspeakable act can harm no one else. Earl Webster Cox would ultimately plead guilty, sealing his fate and ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. He died in custody in 2021. Justice in this case was not swift, but it was certain. It was a long, arduous journey, but in the end, the system, aided by science, delivered on its promise to speak for a little girl who could no longer speak for herself. Today we remember Angie Hausman not for the darkness that ended her life, but for the bright, shining light she was during her 9 short years. We remember her laughter, her love for her pink bicycle, and the trusting smile that was captured in her school portrait. She was a daughter, a friend, and a child full of promise. Her memory serves as a permanent, poignant reminder of the fragility of innocence and the preciousness of every single childhood. To forget Angie would be a second tragedy. To remember her is to honor the life she lived and to reaffirm our collective commitment to protecting our children from the evils that exist in the world. The legacy of Angie's story is also one of vigilance. Her abduction, just steps from her home, was a wake-up call that shattered a community's sense of security. It taught a painful lesson. Danger does not always lurk in dark alleys or faraway places. It can be present on a familiar street in the middle of the afternoon. Her case compels us to have those difficult but necessary conversations with our children about safety. It reminds us to teach them to be aware of their surroundings, to know the difference between a safe stranger and a dangerous one, and to trust their instincts if a situation feels wrong. These are not conversations meant to instill fear, but to empower our children with knowledge. Community support and awareness are our greatest tools in preventing such tragedies. Neighbors looking out for one another, paying attention to unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious behavior, and creating a network of safe houses on a block can make all the difference. Angie's story highlights the importance of immediate action when a child goes missing. The massive volunteer search, while it did not bring her home safely, showed the power of a community united. We must continue to foster this sense of shared responsibility for the well-being of all our children, for they are the most vulnerable among us and deserve our fiercest protection. In the end, the story of Angie Hausman is one of profound loss, but also one of enduring love and relentless pursuit of justice. Her light was extinguished far too soon, but her memory shines on as a beacon. It calls on us to be more vigilant, to be more engaged in our communities, and to never give up hope, even in the face of the longest, coldest silence. Let us honor Angie's memory by working to create a world where every child can complete their walk home from the school bus, safe and sound, their laughter echoing freely in the afternoon sun, just as hers should have for many, many years to come.